Before starting a carnivore diet, I only associated the word histamine in relation to seasonal allergies. Symptoms like runny nose, watery eyes, sneezing, and maybe itching are what came to mind. Most people, including me, have taken antihistamines at some point to combat these issues, and that was basically the extent of my knowledge on the subject. Once I started hanging out with all the crazy carnivores, I began hearing about histamine intolerance and high histamine foods, but I still really had no idea what anybody was talking about. If you're like me and you have a lot to learn about histamine, let's dig into this together. Hi, I'm Jen. I'm a doctor of physical therapy and have experienced radical healing on a carnivore diet. If you're new here, I'm delighted to meet you. First off, let's start with a definition specifically related to diet. Histamine is a chemical that is naturally present in some foods or may build up during the processing of foods. While some foods are particularly high in histamine for either of these reasons, others can affect histamine levels in the body even if the food itself is not high in histamine. People that experience histamine intolerance related to their diet either don't react well to the histamine that they ingest, or they're unable to break down the histamine properly in their body because of the foods they're eating. Now, sometimes it's both. Histamine isn't all bad. It has some really important functions in the body. It's responsible for much of the body's immune response when faced with a foreign invader. It also stimulates gastric acid secretion, affects sex hormones, and increases libido, dilates blood vessels, affects muscle contractions in the lungs and intestines, and increases the rate of heartbeats and the force of the contraction with each heartbeat. Additionally, histamine is a central nervous system neurotransmitter, so it affects the brain and nervous system in many ways. Again, when everything is working well, the presence of histamine in the human body is not a bad thing. It's protective and necessary to allow body systems to work efficiently. However, some people are intolerant to excess histamine and may experience any of the following symptoms: headaches or migraines. These issues can occur because of the blood vessel dilation that histamine can cause, skin rashes or hives. Histamine can cause the skin to become red, flushed, itchy, or to develop hives and rashes. Hives in particular happen when small blood vessels called capillaries dilate and then fluid oozes from the vessels into the surrounding tissue, causing a welt or swelling. Histamine intolerance can also worsen existing skin conditions such as eczema, digestive issues. Histamine can stimulate the production of stomach acid, which, when out of balance, can cause issues like indigestion, acid reflux, abdominal pain, and diarrhea. Histamine intolerance may also play a role in inflammatory bowel disease and irritable bowel disease, nasal congestion, or sinus issues. Histamine can cause the blood vessels in the nasal passages to dilate, leading to nasal congestion, runny nose, itchy, watery eyes, or other sinus issues, fatigue, and sleep disturbances. Histamine is a neurotransmitter that directly affects the brain, so histamine intolerance can lead to fatigue, difficulty sleeping, or disrupted sleep patterns, anxiety, mood swings, or irritability. Histamine affects the central nervous system, as we've discussed, which can lead to mood changes, anxiety, or irritability in people with histamine intolerance. Cardiovascular symptoms. Histamine affects blood vessels and heart function and can lead to symptoms such as low blood pressure, irregular heartbeat, or heart palpitations, muscle and joint pain. Histamine can trigger inflammation in muscles and joints, leading to pain or discomfort. Menstrual cycle irregularities. Histamine can affect hormone levels in the body, particularly related to estrogen. So one of the issues with histamine intolerance is that it can lead to menstrual cycle irregularities. Identifying histamine intolerance can be very tricky because, as you can see, the signs and symptoms are all over the place. There are a few tests that can be completed to help determine if you have histamine intolerance. DAO testing is a blood test that checks your levels of a particular enzyme. DAO stands for diamine oxidase. It's an enzyme that's produced in the small intestine and breaks down histamine in the gut. If DAO testing reveals that your levels are too low, then your body likely isn't able to clear histamine properly, so it builds up and can cause the symptoms that we previously discussed. Provocation testing involves pricking the skin and applying a histamine solution to the prick site. If the response to the histamine solution is exaggerated, that would be indicative of histamine intolerance. A histamine challenge is a test during which you are given histamine-containing foods in order to determine the histamine level that is necessary for triggering symptoms. A hyperactive response to histamine-containing foods would be expected in someone who is histamine intolerant. On the contrary, elimination diets can be used similarly to see if symptoms improve when someone goes on a low or no histamine diet. Genetic testing is another option. There are some genetic mutations that affect DAO, which we discussed previously, as well as another enzyme that we haven't yet discussed. This other enzyme is HNMT, which stands for histamine N-methyltransferase. It's another enzyme that's involved in the metabolism of histamine. Instead of breaking down histamine in the gut, like DAO does, it breaks it down in the central nervous system. If genetic testing reveals mutations to the DAO or HNMT genes, then histamine intolerance can be suspected. It's important to note that some prescription drugs can also interfere with DAO and HNMT levels. Some of these include antibiotics, antidepressants, and narcotics. NSAIDs like ibuprofen and aspirin can affect how the body metabolizes histamine. So even if you don't have a genetic mutation, if you're taking any medications, then they could be the root cause of a histamine intolerance. If you think you may have histamine intolerance, you may be able to have one or more of these tests completed. But the best way to naturally treat histamine intolerance related to your diet is to avoid high histamine foods. That alone may be enough to eliminate all of your symptoms. Here are some tips that may help. Avoid or limit high histamine foods. Foods that are aged, fermented, processed, or high in histamine should be avoided or limited. Examples of high histamine foods include aged cheeses, fermented foods like sauerkraut, soy sauce, and kefir, processed or smoked meats and fish, vinegar and vinegar-containing foods, alcoholic beverages, particularly beer and red wine, as well as canned and processed foods. Choose fresh foods. Meats that are cooked and consumed soon after preparation are generally lower in histamine compared to aged or processed foods. Be cautious with leftovers. Histamine levels increase in foods as they age, so it's important to be cautious with leftovers. Try to consume leftovers within a day or two of preparation or avoid eating them at all. If you're going to keep leftovers, store them properly in the refrigerator to minimize histamine formation. Even better if you store them in the freezer. Avoid histamine-releasing foods. Some foods may trigger the release of histamine in the body even if they are not necessarily high in histamine themselves. Examples of histamine-releasing foods include certain fruits like bananas, avocados, strawberries, and pineapple, vegetables like tomatoes, eggplants, spinach, as well as nuts and chocolate, and other additives and preservatives in the food. Experiment with your diet to identify if any of these foods trigger symptoms in your specific case. Opt for fresh herbs and spices if you're going to use them. Fresh will be lower in histamine than dried or aged. I hope you find these tips helpful if you or someone you know may have histamine intolerance. I created an infographic for you that shows some of the signs and symptoms of histamine intolerance, as well as some tips for relief. Use the link in the caption and you can download it. If you found this helpful, please like and subscribe. And catch me on Instagram where we can connect every day.